Madam President,
Majority Leader is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that cloture motion with respect to the motion to proceed to H.R. 748 be withdrawn.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 748. Further, that the only amendments in order be amendments to be offered by Senator McConnell, 1578, and Senator Sass, 1577, or their designees. Further, that the Senate vote on the Sass amendment with a 60-vote affirmative threshold for adoption. Further, following disposition of the Sass amendment, the McConnell amendment as amended, if amended, be agreed to. The bill as amended be read a third time. And the Senate vote on the passage of the bill as amended with a 60 affirmative vote threshold for passage. Finally, if passed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and that all roll call votes in this series be 30 minutes in length.
Is there objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the bill.
Madam President.
Calendar number 157, H.R. 748, an act to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 and so forth.
Madam President, I ask consent that I proceed under my leader time.
Without objection.
So here we are, colleagues, for the information of all of our senators. We will first vote on the adoption of the Sass amendment at a 60-vote threshold, and then our second and final vote will be on passage of the CARES Act, also at a 60-vote threshold. We're going to pass this bipartisan relief package, send it over to the House, so they can put it on the President's desk. When the Senate adjourns this evening, our next scheduled vote will be the afternoon of Monday, April the 20th. Of course, during this unprecedented time for our country, the Senate is going to stay nimble. As always, we'll convene regular pro forma sessions, and if circumstances require the Senate to return for a vote sooner than April the 20th, we will provide at least 24 hours notice. Our nation obviously is going through a kind of crisis that is totally unprecedented in living memory. Let's stay connected and continue to collaborate on the best ways to keep helping our states and our country through this pandemic. And let's continue to pray for one another, for all of our families, and for our country.
Madam President.
The Minority Leader is recognized.
Now, Madam President, and I'll speak for a little bit briefly. The legislation now before us is historic because it is meant to match a historic crisis. Our healthcare system is not prepared to care for the sick. Our workers. We have order, Madam President. Our workers, our healthcare system is not prepared to care for the sick. Our workers are without work. Our businesses cannot do business. Our factories lie idle. The gears of the American economy have ground to a halt. Our country has faced immense challenges before, but rarely so many at the same time. Over the past few days, the Senate has stepped into the breach. We packed weeks or perhaps months of legislative process into 5 days. Representatives from both sides of the aisle and both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue have forged a bipartisan agreement in highly partisan times with very little time to spare. It's been a long, hard road with a remarkable number of twists and turns, but for the sake of millions of Americans, it will be worth it. It will be worth it to save millions of small businesses and tens of millions of jobs. It will be worth it to see that Americans who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own will be able to pay their rent and mortgages and put food on the table because we passed the greatest expansion of insurance to the unemployed in decades. It will be worth it to send gloves and masks to our nurses and to our doctors. It will be worth it to send ventilators and beds to our hospitals. and begin rebuilding the public health infrastructure in America, a Marshall Plan in this new century for our medical system. It'll be worth it to save industries from the brink of collapse in order to save the jobs of hundreds of thousands of Americans in those industries. It will be worth it to put workers first. It was a long, hard road. Neither side can be completely happy with the final product, but it will be worth it. And I'm damn proud of the work we did over the past few days, because we put in the work, because we tested the limits of exhaustion, because we didn't immediately accept a bill drafted by only one party. The legislation before us tonight is better. Better for our health care system and the 65,000 Americans now afflicted with COVID-19. Better for our workers, better for our small businesses, better for our Indian tribes, better for our economy, and better for the American people. And so I must thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, especially the chairs and ranking members and their staffs. The past few days have been filled with drama. The past few hours were no exception. I know a few of my Republican friends still harbor reservations about voting for this legislation. But when there's a crisis of this magnitude, the private sector cannot solve it. Individuals, even with bravery and valor, are not powerful enough to beat it back. Government is the only force large enough to staunch the bleeding and begin the healing. This is a time when the American people need their government. This is what we were elected for. The oath we swear to the Constitution means we must protect the general welfare of the people. So let us marshal this government into action. There are millions of Americans watching us right now at home on their televisions, separated from friends and family, fearful for their children and their livelihoods, unsure of when the time will come when all of our lives may return to normal. Let us tell them tonight that help is on the way, that they are not truly alone, that this country, that this Senate, that this government is here for them in a time of dire need. This is a strange and evil disease. There is much we still don't know about it, and it is keeping us apart. When we pass this bill, instead of hugging each other, we'll wave from a distance. None of us can know when this plague will pass. The only thing we know for sure is that we must summon the same spirit that saw previous generations through America's darkest hours. Fellowship, sacrifice, fortitude, resilience. That is what it means to be an American. With that spirit, this nation faced down war and depression and fear itself. I have no doubt that once again, America will ultimately prevail. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
Majority Leader is recognized.
I call up the substitute amendment 1578 and ask that it be reported by number.
Without objection, the amendment will be reported by member.
Senator from Kentucky, Mr. McConnell, proposes an amendment number 1578.
The senator from Nebraska is recognized.
I call up amendment number 1577 and ask that it be reported by number.
Without objection, the amendment will be reported by member.
The senator from Nebraska, Mr. Sass, proposes an amendment numbered 1577 to amendment numbered 1578.
Questions on the Sass amendment?
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Lankford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Loeffler. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney. Thank you. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen,
So
Mr.
what is everybody
Warner,
going to spend their Trump bucks on?
Ms.
Looks like
Warren,
a lot of us are going to be making, we're getting
Mr. Whitehouse,
$1,200,
Mr. Wicker,
$1,200 from the federal
Mr. White,
government. Not sure what to do with it though.
Mr. Young,
Some bills to pay, but also some savings, right? That's the wise thing to do. If you can save it, that's for sure.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Braun, Kramer, Daines, Enzi, Fisher, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Loeffler, Manchin, McConnell, Perdue, Risch, Rubio, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, and Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Durbin, Schatz, and Schumer. Ms. McSally, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mrs. Murray, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Ms. Duckworth, no.
Here in Washington, where a last-minute snag is
Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Booker? No. Mr. Roberts? Aye. Mr. Casey? No. Mr. Merkley? No. Mr. Young? Aye. Mr. Heinrich? No. Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mrs. Capito? Aye. Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mr. Risch? Aye. Ms. Smith? No. Ms. Cortez Masto? No. Ms. Hassan? No. Ms. Rosen? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Mr. Cornyn? Aye. Mr. Tillis? Aye. Thank you. Mr. Crapo? Aye. Mr. Peters? No. Mr. Udall? No. Mr. King? No. Mr. Leahy? No. Ms. Harris? No. Mr. Gardner? No. Mr. Jones? No. Mrs. Feinstein? No. Ms. Warren? No. Mr. Sanders? No. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Cardin, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Warner, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Bennett, no. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Carper, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Ms. Sinema, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Menendez? No. Mr. Grassley? Aye. Mr. Brown? No. Ms. Collins? No. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 48, the nays are 48. The 60 vote threshold having not been achieved, the amendment is not agreed to. Under the previous order, amendment number 1578 is agreed to. The clerk will read the title of the bill for the third time.
Counter number 157, H.R. 748, an act to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to repeal the excise tax on high-cost employer-sponsored health coverage.
The question is on passage of H.R. 748 as amended. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin.
The 1577 was not agreed to. The McConnell Amendment, 1578 is agreed to.
John's going to come in 11:30. We're good. Thank you, Gardner.
I'm gonna take those on the line. I have the sanitizer, but
I do.
my husband said,
We talked about that. So I'm putting it on the media. I might do that. Next time this happens, we gotta talk about that. We could probably make that work if we got 3 or 4.
there's money in this bill, but they would grant because of the ice. But let them know. They're not providing. So if we get all that, there's money there to yeah, I'm chairman of the program. Subcommittee.
So of course, the military's still out there. They can get it. If we need to vote on something, they'll get it. That's good to know that. Thank you. So be safe.
Easy now.
What 60?
Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal.
But they lost 2. Had a good one.
Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker.
We have performance.
Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher,
Take the dogs out. See you during the day.
Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Leffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Markley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Markowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Barrasso, Bennett, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Duckworth, Durbin, Enzi, Ernst, Feinstein, Fisher, Gardner, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Harris, Hassan, Hawley, Hirono, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kane, Kennedy, King, Langford, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, McSally, Menendez, Merkley, Moran, Murkowski, Murphy, Perdue, Peters, Portman, Reed, Risch, Roberts, Rosen, Rounds, Rubio, Sanders, Sass, Schatz, Schumer, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Sullivan, Tester, Tillis, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden, Young. No senator voted in the negative. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye.
So why aren't these senators adhering to social distancing? You see a lot of these politicians and secretaries just hanging out rather close to one another, not really adhering to the protocols that are being put out to the rest of the nation about, you know, keeping a distance from one another, maintaining certain, protocols. But just kind of curious that these people don't seem to really show that sort of care or conscientiousness. Well, go ahead and read over what's in the package while they thaw and wait to do this. Let me just turn down the volume. So I wasn't sure if there was more than one bill that was making its way through the House, but so far I know of this one bill, a $2 trillion package. And here are the details, some bullet points. Direct payments of $1,200 to most individuals making up to $75,000, or 2,400 couples making up to $1,500. $150,000. Each dependent child increases the amount by an additional $500. Amount decreases for individuals with incomes above $75,000, and payments cut off for those above $99,000. It's going to really help out a lot of poor people and people above the poverty line as well, and really not help out anybody who is making above $75,000, and nothing for anybody above $99,000. There are probably going to be other things for people of this category. I know it seems like these people aren't going to be getting much or anything in the case of this group, but these people who make this much money have other interests. These aren't your common people who are working 9 to 5 at a McDonald's or a Walmart or a local shop. Right? These are people who tend to have professional jobs, a lot of security involved in it, maybe even own some property. So there are other things, other ways of helping these people out.
Aye.
Okay, so it seems like the Senate's back on. I'm just going to turn that down for a little bit while I continue to talk. I'll just continue on next bullet point. Expanded unemployment benefits that boosts maximum benefit by $600 per week and provides laid off workers their full pay 4 months. Full pay 4 months. That's kind of interesting. I hadn't exactly heard that before. This is kind of interesting. So basically, they're going to add this amount on top of whatever your state is going to give you benefit. Eligibility is being extended, which is very cool for some people that I know that were independent contractors doing things like dog walking and other jobs, and who found themselves out of a job because of the quarantine, but unable to apply for unemployment benefits due to their status as an independent contractor. This ends that discrepancy or that difference and basically offers up money to these people, which is good. This is what I was talking about before for the wealthier class of people. It seems like, oh no, the bill hasn't passed yet. We're still waiting. See someone in the chat asking if the bill passed. No, it hasn't passed yet. They've been giving speeches all day, and they've just recently voted on an amendment to another bill. So no, it's coming up, but soon. As I was saying, the package that's going to be voted on this evening includes, in addition to cash handouts, billions of dollars in loans for small businesses, billions of dollars just for local governments to handle their business, billions for hospitals, and billions in loans for larger industries. I don't see it here, but I did see or hear somewhere else that some of these small business loans, these business oriented loans, would be forgivable, meeting certain criteria, which if true is very, very good. It's a good way for people to start businesses or reestablish or revamp their business and still be able to not have to pay that money back in the future. This is interesting too. I guess they wanted to make sure the president didn't get any kind of accusations of conflict of interest, which is fine. I think that's... I don't know if this is totally necessary, but I guess in today's world, if it just makes it easier to pass this legislation, then so be it. Pretty sure this family doesn't really need any help right now. This, not sure, I guess. And this, I'm not really sure about this either, what this means or what this entails. So there we go. That's basically it. I'm not going to go over too much here because I don't want to dive too deep. But those are the basics of the package. I'll put it here. Again, these are just basics. I'm sure there are more details involved in each of these points that I can't really explain in detail. But there it is. I'm going to cut the mic off. I'm going to cut the mic off for a moment, take care of some business. I'll leave the stream on for a bit. Definitely going to leave it on until the vote's over.
Today's favorite way to report a story is from their prison of two ideas, where they are lifers. In that two idea cell, you're either pro-immigration or a xenophobic bigot. You either love this planet or embrace evil big oil. You're either for peace or you want war. Their latest, you either shut down the economy and
Here comes the money.
Here we go. Money talk.
Here comes the money. Money, money, money.
Dollar, dollar. Dollar, dollar. Ching, ching, bling, bling, got the chatter. You ain't talking money, then your talking don't matter. Ching, ching, bling, bling, patent pockets. We take the dollar, dollar, can a damn soul stop it? Here comes the new kid on the block. Hold all your bets, here's where the buck stops. See, first of all, I'm stepping out on my own. About time I elevated to claim my own throne. Success in my blood, call it homegrown. Puerto Rican testosterone. Power and money got me crazy cocky. No longer need you, Poppy. I know you're mad because you can't stop me. And if you wonder how this player done scooped your honey, I think she smell my cologne, it's called brand new money. Making major moves, man, ain't a damn thing funny. Pimpin' hood rats to Playboy bunnies. They see the... They see it, they see it. Say what? Money. I'm global dollar, dollar, and roll with Bow Fitty. Like to go out smelling fresh and looking spiffy. Don't like clean money, I want my wrist to be filthy. Pops with that retirement fund, I can't touch till I'm 60. So what am I supposed to do? Rolling through, steady patting them pockets, sell I'm stacking holding two. Ching, ching, bling, bling, catching cash in lumps. It's a Coro, get a jacket, I'm selling them out my trunk. Whenever, whatever, it takes to shake down a dollar. Mozo in that direction, wait a minute, holla, holla. All wants to know where they go, where they winning. A mink and Marshall Monday smelling just like a mint. You know, back in the days, they said money is who's all money. Nowadays, money is who's the rich tree. Come on. Now, if you can't see the money, get your eyes clean with Visine. I need 5 things plus 7 digits at a time. See my cheering, chilling. The best never works. See, we never get the pebbles, they got the rocks first. Bank vaults, I'm locking. Ching, ching, we're mocking. I'm rocking. My family Christmas stockings are shocking. Fine women, any weather. Naughty denim and leather. Call it tricking, whatever, son, they get better. I'm one smart cookie, the vet that smacks rookies. My stock's on top, your checks bounce while mine's boogie. Wrist, I must rock it. Chick, stop it, I knock it. Cash looks like I got a gang of fists in my pockets. Fist in my pockets. Fist in my pockets.
Here comes the money. Money, money, money,
All right, that's it for now. I just wanted to get the stream going to cover the Senate vote. It took much longer than I expected. I didn't realize it was going to go on until late evening. Here I am near 9 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. Wow. Okay, well that's it. Looks like we're going to get paid, people. So figure out what you're going to spend your Trump bucks on, or if you'll save it. I'll probably save some of it. However, I do have some bills that I had to hold over because of lost hours due to forced to be quarantined and shutdowns. So definitely going to use that to pay back some people that deserve to be paid back. Otherwise, probably save a lot of it. I have made some purchases recently, like video games, to help with boredom. So already made expenses there, so I don't think I'm going to be spending much after the fact once I get the money. Really just want to handle debts, basically. I think a lot of people are just going to be thinking about debts. Some people will be thinking about luxury items. You know, spend it how you want. It's your money. But just be wise. That's all. Okay. Take care, anybody listening. See you next time.